Adventures in Consciousness by Janeroberts, Chapter 2, A Reincarnational Drama and Other Unofficial Events. The energy from that one class seemed to spread outward into my students' private lives. During that week, Sue Watkins called to tell me that she had an experience that she was positive was connected with the Seth experiment. I was getting ready for bed, she said. The lights were on. Suddenly my legs and arms felt huge and much heavier, and I looked down, and I swear they were that way. And at the same time, this curious wonder flashed through my mind, like, how fantastic bodies are. What amazing machines. And I was full of this appreciation of how bodies work. But it wasn't me. It was the most alien sensation. It was someone not used to living in a body at all. Dorothy, another student, called to tell me that she'd seen three-dimensional triangles around the ceiling of her dining room in the morning 3 times in a row. And if my intellect wanted something to work on, my intuitive self was seeing to it that I got what I wanted, because the next class, once again, presented me with perfect examples of the kind of experiences that so intrigued me, yet threw me into a critical quandary. 5 students reported having class dreams in quotes, in which they attended a class at another level of reality with Seth as a teacher. Such dreams, with many variations, are now a regular part of the class's extracurricular activities. In them, I'm convinced that students develop themes and experiences begun in class. Often, Seth is used as a symbol for the individual's own greater consciousness. In a class only last week, for example, a young man, Larry, told of a dream in which he saw Seth's face close to his own. Seth looked physical and real and appeared looking exactly like a portrait that my husband Rob painted of him several years ago. This painting hangs in the living room where the class is held, and it has been reproduced in the Seth Material. In their dreams, many students see Seth in that guise. When Larry finished telling his dream, Seth came through with one of the best sessions to date. It began with the question, "Who is Seth?" The first part was directed to Larry, the dreamer. I'm quoting a few paragraphs from the session here because they contain information that I didn't have back then when the class first started reporting class dreams. What Seth said the other night to Larry was this: "Who is Seth? I put this question to you. What magic has worked here in class that you work and that we all work together? Now, I will tell you this. On the one hand, I am someone you do not know, lost before the annals of time as you understand it, lost in the annals of the past and the future as you understand them. On the other hand, that is what I am, and that is a loaded sentence. On the other hand, I am yourself. So through me do you view and meet the selves that you are, and so I rise in your terms from the power and antiquity and the glory of your own being, projected outward into the world of time from a universe in which time is meaningless." In 1971, though, I was upset by the implications I saw in Seth as a spirit guide popping in and out of people's dreams, particularly since they took this as proof of Seth's independent existence in a way that bothered me. That particular night, then, I was fascinated by dream events reported, but refused to accept let me start that sentence over again, okay? That particular night, then, I was fascinated by the dream events reported, but refused to accept pat explanations. Yet, I couldn't find any others that satisfied me. But the dreams were merely the beginning. As I listened, I suddenly felt Seth II's pyramid above my head again. Not physical, but just as real. I could feel my consciousness rushing upward, seeping out gradually at first and then faster, even as I thought with mixed wonder and skepticism. Bodiless observers from another world, triangles appearing from nowhere on dining room ceilings, and Here I go again. I was gone. After a certain point, whenever Seth too is involved, there is an emptiness through which I sense I must travel. Then a live spot of contact. Then that atonal voice begins to speak. As always, students told me afterwards what I said, and the session was recorded. The experiment continues, and the voice began. We are trying to appreciate the nature of your present existence, so that you who are curious about the nature of non-physical reality may then follow us, using this voice as a guideline into existence that knows neither blood nor tissue. Follow then beyond the knowledge of the flesh to those domains from which flesh is born. Feel the kernel of your consciousness rise beyond the knowledge of the seasons. For you, there may seem to be an unbearable loneliness because you are so used to relating to the warm victory of flesh, and here there is no physical being with whom to relate. Yet beyond and within that isolation is a point of light that is consciousness. It pulses with the power behind all the emotions you know. It feeds them and sends them sparkling and tumbling into the reality that you recognize. This is the warmth that forms the pulse of physical existence, and yet is born from the very devotion of our isolation, that is born from the creativity that is beyond flesh and bone, that forms fingers without feeling fingers, that forms the seasons without knowing summer or winter, that creates the reality you know without itself experiencing it. From that devotion and creativity comes all that you know, and all of that has also been given to us, for the energy that we have is not ours alone, nor are we the source of it. It flows through us as it flows through you. The experiment then continues as it always has, only in your past you were not aware of it. The voice stopped. I started my downward climb, getting lost and disoriented for a moment, and then suddenly, surely descending through the levels of my awareness. Almost every student had experienced some expansion of consciousness while Seth too spoke. Rog, an engineer, felt as if he were alone in space, with nothing to act against, and overwhelmed by loneliness. To one extent or another, many of the students felt the same kind of suspension and isolation. Joel, the young man who found himself involved in the Crusades battle the class before, also felt himself surrounded by space. He seemed to be bodiless, drawn towards a gigantic flower. As he fell headlong into the open petals, the inside of the flower expanded so that it seemed bottomless. He felt as though he could fall through it forever. His experience made me think. When Seth too comes through, I was switching to another level of consciousness and observing physical reality from that viewpoint. Were Seth too's beings an unconscious dramatization of that level of awareness itself? Or did these beings exist in some other way, like Joel's flower? Was the flower Joel's own interpretation of another kind of consciousness too? In other words, how literally could we take Seth too's message? If Seth too was a representation of another portion of our own psyche, dramatized, then couldn't the message be interpreted to mean that other non-physical parts of our present selves watched our reality couched in our own psyches? And were we being encouraged to experience to some degree, the vast portions of our own souls from which our physical reality springs? The difference between Seth and Seth too was dramatized that night too, because when the students finished discussing what had happened, Seth came through. With Seth too, students had to strain to hear the quiet, unemotional, almost colorless tones. My face was expressionless, my body slack, But Seth's voice boomed out. My body took on a more muscular, active air, and Seth was there, speaking and looking out. He often looks at particular people and singles them out so that there's no doubt about whom he's talking to. He spoke to Joel at once. Your flower was an excellent image, and in your terms, it represents the characteristics of space as you might relate to it. Specifically, it is your symbol for the physicist's black hole. These black holes are other dimensions of actuality, in which the reality that you know is automatically translated in different terms, not annihilated. Then he told the class that they were learning to manipulate at other levels of awareness. I knew that they were, of course, but I wasn't prepared for what followed. We were discussing class events and Seth's interpretation of Joel's mental adventure when I became aware of loud voices in one corner of the room. I heard the word Indian. Then people turned towards Joel and Betty. Their manner told me at once that they were involved in what I call a reincarnational drama. That is, they were convinced that they were acting out a definite episode from a past life. Again, these dramas intrigue me, but I'm always aware of how little we know about the nature of consciousness or memory. Now I see reincarnation in a much broader context than I did then, and as you'll see later in this book, certainly the following episode, among others, had as much to do with the intense questioning that led me to aspects and quotes. Betty wore one of the long ankle-length skirts, then coming into style. Her legs were spread out beneath it, her arms on her hips. It was easy to imagine a rifle lying across her knees. Her smallish eyes were furious. She looked at the world like the 19th century pioneer woman she thought she was at that moment. You only killed my whole damn family, kids and all, she hissed at Joel, and her eyes never left his face. You killed your own husband, he said. To all of us, the normally slight Indian characteristics of his face now seemed exaggerated. His voice was tense, but he didn't have the emotional force of Betty's. Then he said slowly, You killed them. We didn't. What did you do it for? Because he was a coward, because I had a bunch of crying kids and I didn't need a crying husband to boot. Yes, I did it and I'll do it again. Is that what you want to know? Her voice was fiercely calm. The class was quiet. We were alert, ready in case Joel and Betty really got into it. I was having my own difficulties in my mind. I saw the scene that they'd been describing. Betty squatting in front of this hut of a house, on her hands and knees almost, handing out guns to the kids while the Indian band came rushing over the hill towards the clearing. For an instant, through Betty's perspective, I heard the blood-curdling screams, howls really, and I felt her fury. Her cries rose in my throat. I pulled myself together. I had the class to think of, and I wanted to monitor Betty and Tom's experience, not fall in with it. But Joel was backing off some, I could tell, and he said, You were taking our land. We were just defending it. Didn't you care what you were doing to us? Hell no, she cried, staring back at him. Why should I? I didn't give a damn about what happened to the Indians. I just cared about my own kids, and I protected them. I'll tell you that. I knew. When you were on the warpath, though, that I knew. Now her eyes were really beady, and she leaned forward threateningly. Her emotional belligerence filled the room. There was a moment's silence, and then we watched. The intentness began to leave Joel's broad features. A smoothness seemed to fill out the contours of his face, and he started to speak as a personality called Dave. I'd heard Dave speak once before in class, but the class hadn't, though they knew about him. I stayed where I was, and I watched Betty and Joel and the class reactions. All attention was riveted on Joel's face as students searched for the differences between this speaking for Dave, Joel, and the Joel they knew. My reactions were mixed. I sensed the class's strong pivoting towards the new personality, the awe, the hope that perhaps here was an answer. Maybe Dave had answer to life's problems and could explain them simply. They wouldn't have to work for their own answers. Someone else would do it for them. Great. They've learned a lot, I thought, sardonically. There they sat, teachers, business people, college kids, listening to another voice, another guru, someone else who might have the answers and be flattered or cajoled enough to give them up. But I was being unfair, I told myself, and to some extent I was. The phenomenon of speaking for another personality is unusual and startling enough to capture anyone's attention and bring to mind all of our old legends of gods speaking through mortals. Spirits looking out of human eyes, gods, devils, and sprites cavorting through the fields of the human psyche. Dave's voice was very much like Joel's. He spoke intently but dispassionately, while Betty stared back with a mixture of awe and defiance. She was still furious, but at Joel, not at Dave. You knew that Indian men and women were dying, Dave said. Didn't that affect you at all? All I knew was who was on the warpath and when, Betty said in a hard voice. Did you know when your own race was on the warpath? Dave asked calmly, as if translating or speaking to a child. No, Betty yelled angrily. I was in my own existence. All I cared about were my kids, and you took care of that. She stopped, glowering, because Joel had been replaced by Dave, and from then on, when she answered Dave, she called him Sir in a tone that neatly mixed deference with sarcasm. After a rather lengthy discussion, though, Betty said that she felt better towards Joel now, and she realized that his people had been caught up in their own passion and were only trying to defend their land. She grinned and she said, Don't fight with me anymore either. Just be nice. Her attitude was so different than it had been that a few people laughed. I mean it, she said. I've learned a lot from that lifetime, and in this life, I'm a regular crusader when it comes to Indians. I have great feeling for them. Whenever anyone mentions the blacks as the downtrodden minority, I remind them of the Indians. So, I must have forgiven them for what they did to me. And then, when Dave answered, though, Betty couldn't refrain from saying, Oh, thank you, sir, with that hard look that came back into her eyes. The entire episode took nearly an hour. Part of the time Dave spoke alone or answered Betty's questions, and now and then I asked a question, but all the while I kept myself focused on the objective room, because whenever I let my consciousness stray, I was back in that hut with Betty. I kept feeling her screams in my throat, and I was determined not to give voice to them. For one thing, I didn't want to interject my own perceptions at that point. This was primarily Betty's and Joel's experience, and I was curious as to what they'd do with it on their own. For another thing, I had the whole class to think of, and I wasn't about to unleash all that emotion in that room, particularly when I sensed I'd be thrown into the event myself and unable to monitor it properly. There were no dates given for the Indian attack. Dave mentioned a name, Kewate, K-E-W-A-T-E, or Kuwata, K-E-W-A-T-A, without giving its designation. When asked for the name of the tribe, he said, it was an offshoot of a larger nation or conglomerate of tribes, and the language is not familiar to me. It was something like Shu, S-H-U, Shushanak. When it was all over, Betty said that she felt animosity towards Joel since he came to class. She had felt animosity towards Joel since he'd come to class. And now she understood the reason for it, and also her habitual passionate defense of the Indians. The emotions that had swirled around us had just dissipated. As this happened, Joel shook his head, coughed, and looked dazed for a moment and said, Hey, what's been going on? What indeed? One thing that was instantly apparent to me, Dave had come to Joel's aid precisely when Betty's belligerence was strongest. Moreover, he nicely took the wind from Betty's emotional sails, a fact I'm sure she recognized and resented. Dave, not Joel, in the framework they were working in, and Dave's loftier attitude changed the immediacy of the earlier encounter to one in which Betty lost her equal status. On Joel's part, this was excellent psychological footwork at the least. 3 levels of activity were involved. The usual Joel as Indian in a past life encounter, and Joel as David, a personality who was supposed to contain the knowledge of the other 2. Yet the phenomenon itself bothered me. There was a strained quality about it, as if one part of Joel's personality didn't know what to do with the other part. The performance was cracked in a funny fashion, as if someone was trying too hard, but with the best of intentions. Some sensed contact wasn't quite made. I didn't accept Dave as a spirit in the usual terms, but then I didn't look at Seth that way either. The whole affair, of course, made me wonder again about the nature of Seth, but he is a fully rounded personality in a way difficult to explain, and he arrived in my experience that way. There was never any strain involved. While I appreciated the levels of consciousness being utilized by Joel, I was also struck by a certain feeling of grotesqueness, of ability that struggled to be used, and yet also caught in a dilemma of psychological duplicity. But all this was quite aside from the questions about the reincarnational material itself. Did Betty and Joel actually live the event that they seemed to be remembering so vividly? Was I mentally hearing the piercing screams of a woman about to see her children slain? I'd felt as if I could have lost myself for a while in that other time and place. Yet Betty, I knew, was full of belligerence at this particular time in her life. Had the entire episode been a creative, emotional drama that freed her from that pressure in a safe framework? Joel, then, would have had to have his own reasons for participating. Certainly the entire class seemed released, purged. Had the 2 main actors dramatized the combined, withheld, aggressive energy of the entire group? My questions were endless, it seemed. Most of the students took it for granted that a definite reincarnational event had been re-experienced. I admitted that the entire episode was valid, and I also suspected that its validity might straddle our concepts. Again, I felt that reincarnation was something far more significant than usually supposed, and that by accepting it, per se, we might prevent ourselves from discovering its real meaning, real in quotes. A short time later, you'll see, I was to be presented with a unique example of a past life personality in a surprising encounter involving Sue and my husband Rob, an experience which would also throw light on Joel's performance in class as Dave. As it were, I knew enough not to interpret our experiences in old dogmatic ways. The dogma of spiritualism or reincarnation can be quite as limiting as any more conventional church dogma. Yet I was unable to see another framework, so I kept knocking my head against mental walls. From Seth 2 to Indian war cries was quite enough for one evening. From bodiless observers from another system of reality to the emotional power of Betty's belligerence against a man she believed had wiped out her whole family over a century ago. But whatever was going on, we all had to get up early in the morning, so I ended the class. Yet, as people filed out of the room, I thought, how great that we all feel free enough to explore the nature of our own consciousness together. Who knows what we might discover? And I still feel that way. The next day, though, I spent 2 hours writing down my impressions of that class, trying to sort out my own attitudes. I just put a piece of paper in the typewriter and started writing whatever came to my mind without questioning. I find this an excellent method of releasing pertinent questions and ideas. In fact, until I read what I'd written, I didn't realize that I'd actually chosen one main direction from several others, which had also attracted me. I'd found the spirit guide designation more and more hampering. At the same time, that's exactly how people related to Seth. Whenever I objected, they became confused. For one thing, many people want desperately to believe in life after death, want to believe in life after death, and spirit guides automatically offer them proof. Besides this, however, the concept presents a framework in which a spirit can be encountered in any medium's living room without intermediaries to bring comfort, solve problems, and provide intimacy with spiritual realities that the churches have long forsaken. Even in the beginning of my own experiences, I didn't think it was that simple, nor for that matter did Seth describe himself in those terms. But up to this June class, I'd suspected my own doubts. Maybe my intellect was getting in the way, I thought. Maybe Seth was a spirit guide, just as people said, and exactly in those terms. But maybe reincarnation existed the way others thought it did too. After reading over my own notes the next day, though, I saw that I wasn't going to let Seth be stereotyped, and that I had to allow my own experience to expand in its own way. My attitude towards Seth my attitude towards Seth was pretty well expressed in the following paragraph. Last night, Seth too led us into adventures in consciousness that are liberating, creative, and valid. I think that they certainly increase individual perception and may be forming a group class level awareness that overlaps into the dream state. But I don't want to feel forced to visualize a disembodied spirit peeking in on us. I think we're really onto something, but I don't know what it is yet. If we take it for granted that everything we can't explain is the result of spirits, then we're just left with dogma again. And about the reincarnational drama, I wrote the following. Again, a terrific adventure in consciousness for those involved, in which the participants experienced reality in a different way and set up new gestalts of relatedness. They looked at existence from an entirely different focus than usual, and to some extent or another, let each class member do the same thing. As such, I think that this was constructive, dynamic, and exciting. I don't know whether or not Joel and Betty were reliving definite past events, or whether the idea of reincarnation provided a framework through which these experiences could flow, releasing them from their usual life roles. Maybe it doesn't even matter, but I think that there is strong pressure from people involved in the psychic field, amateurs and professionals alike, to accept such events at their face value. Sometimes, from their remarks and letters, I think that people want to believe in something so badly that they feel threatened when I question my own experience, or that they want me to write a kind of Bible from which all uncertainty is removed for them. But then I'd be caught up in a dogma that I'd be sworn to protect, and I'd never have the guts to examine my own ideas again. I just can't go looking for neat little cliche symbols to tuck my experience in, because underneath it all, there is something invaluable that as people we've always overlooked. And just maybe I can get a few clues as to what it is. I wrote these paragraphs vehemently, certainly exaggerating to some degree, but at least I felt clearer about my own attitudes than I had in some time. Considering my feelings, you can imagine my reaction to Martin Crocker, who attended my next class. The appointment had been set up for months earlier. Martin, I found out, personified all the ideas that I just decided I could do without. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 2. And chapter 3 is entitled A Spirit Guide. Is a spirit guide is a ... question mark? Okay, hope you're enjoying this. Like and subscribe. Till soon.